Hello, welcome back. What I want to talk about today is tithing and the law of circulation, what it's all about, and does it make a difference? Tithing has had a bad reputation, but I want to give you a little bit about the history of tithing and show you how it evolved and show you how significant it is today in building a prosperity consciousness. Tithing has been traced back to ancient Egyptian and Babylonian customs. The number 10 was a sacred number in Egyptian numerology. It symbolized wholeness or perfection. To be a soldier in ancient Egypt meant one was a perfect 10. Once a soldier was tithed, his body wounded by 10%, he was no longer self-reliant and was removed from battle. Tithing was a common practice in ancient culture, even before the Hebrews adopted the custom. People were often expected to tithe the spoils of war to their gods. In ancient Hebrew tradition, to tithe was to make oneself vulnerable, to give up control, and to claim reliance upon God. Tithing was an act of faith that demonstrated their belief that God would provide for them in times of need. During the 17th century, tithing wars erupted as the European churches imposed and strictly enforced a system of tithing that was essentially taxation. Parishioners revolted against the clergy and stoned the bailiffs and auctioneers who were charged with collecting the tithe. In America, tithing has been linked to fundraising strategies when the church has fallen upon lean times. Tithing was also popularized in 1876 by a businessman, Thomas Paine, primarily as a means of material gain. Tithing is not the goal of the Christian life, but it does offer a way to help us remember God, who is the source of all creation. And from Proverbs, the third chapter, the ninth verse, tithing as a spiritual discipline helps us reconnect all of life to the creator of life. In the economy of God, both giver and recipient are blessed. Jesus proclaimed the same truth when he said, as John in Luke 6:38. As John Bunyan wrote, there was a man, some called him mad. The more he gave, the more he had. God instructs us to give generously so that we can participate in the blessings prepared for the generous. Tithing is not something to do in the emotion of the moment. It is a discipline. It is a spiritual discipline and a spiritual practice. We attract good because as we tithe, we put our attention on God. And remember, God is the creative force in the universe. God is wisdom and love and patience and understanding and power. Those are all the attributes of God, and those attributes are also within us. And when we focus on those attributes, they spring forth into our lives. Tithing is not giving back to God, but leaving with God a portion of God's good in order to sustain our realization of our oneness with God, which is what we realize when we tithe. We could think of it this way. I took 90% of my good and left 10% with God. The 10% could be thought of as seeds for the next harvest. The farmer who consumes 100% of this year's crop has nothing left to sow for the next year's crop. A tithe is a tenth. God says to keep 90% of all your new income and give back 10% to those who do God's work. It is then used as a seed to multiply back to you. Good measure, pressed down to fit more in, shaken together to fit even more good in and running over, because your present life cannot fit all the good that God has already prepared for you. In the tithing process, the tither builds a deep spiritual realization of always being one with their good. Now, this is important. In the tithing process, the tither builds a deep spiritual realization of always being one with their good. There is nothing that builds a consciousness of true wealth like freely and joyously giving the tithe. During the time that we might feel too poor to tithe, we might not even be aware that we are building a consciousness of more poverty. Now listen to this. The thought, I cannot afford to tithe, is a poverty thought which will only beget more poverty. So who do you tithe to? You tithe to your spiritual source, where you get spiritually fed. That could be a church, an organization, even a person who in some way feeds you spiritually. That is who you give your tithe to. And when you do, it comes back to you multiplied. And this has been proven to be true. This is the end of part one. If you feel that you have to go over and listen to it again to really understand the concept of tithing, I invite you to do so. When you are ready, please continue to part two, and I will see you there.